Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be looking at something, pretty fascinating, at least for me. And it has to do with this connection between algorithms, how algorithms grow, information theory, and, kind of the development of complex systems, and in particular, the brain. And you sent us some really interesting notes from a seminar on this, and wow, did this rabbit hole ever go deep? So I think we're going to have some aha moments today as we try to unpack how complexity can arise from simple rules. And this is going to have us really kind of rethinking how we view nature and even artificial intelligence.
Sounds like you're ready to dive into some pretty deep concepts then.
Yeah, for sure. From what I gathered, the main idea here is that, complex structures, like take our brains, for example, maybe they aren't built from these incredibly detailed blueprints like we often think. Instead, maybe it's a matter of simpler processes, like, guided by some basic rules that are just repeated over and over and over again.
That's a great way to sum it up. And it really challenges us to rethink that assumption that you absolutely need these intricate plans to end up with complexity. Kind of like, think about those domino chain reactions, where just a single domino can set off this elaborate cascade.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. So where do we even begin with this whole idea that simple rules can lead to such complexity?
Well, the concept itself isn't exactly new. If you think about it, back in the 1940s, John von Neumann, who, was a brilliant mathematician and really instrumental in those early computer developments, was already thinking along these lines. I mean, he was really captivated by this idea of self-replication and how these kind of simple rules could actually result in pretty surprising outcomes.
It's amazing to think that someone working on the earliest computers was already pondering these connections, like between math and biology.
Yeah, and, his work, along with Stanislaw Ulam's, kind of led to this whole idea of cellular automata.
Yeah.
Now, picture this. You've got a grid where each cell can be, let's say, on or off. And you've got these simple rules that determine how each of these cells interacts with its neighbors.
So are we talking about like a really, really basic computer program or?
In a way, yeah. But the truly fascinating thing is that when you actually run these simulations, you start seeing these complex patterns just kind of emerge over time. It's almost like watching a virtual world unfold right before your eyes.
Whoa, that's starting to get my head spinning a bit. Do you have an example that might help me wrap my mind around this a little better?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most famous examples is Conway's Game of Life. Now, it's a game with only 4 simple rules, but get this. Those 4 rules can generate these intricate structures, these behaviors, and they almost seem lifelike. You know what I mean? You see things like oscillators, gliders, even self-replicating patterns, all emerging from just these basic instructions.
Wow. So much complexity from just 4 simple rules. But I'm a little confused. If the rules are fixed, like the same input always giving you the same output, shouldn't we be able to predict what's going to happen?
Yeah, that's where it gets really, really interesting. You're absolutely right. The rules themselves are deterministic. But the thing is, you can't really predict what pattern's going to emerge at a specific point in time without actually running that simulation.
So you mean like we can't just calculate the outcome? We have to let the whole thing play out step by step.
Exactly. And, that brings us to this idea of undecidability. There's no shortcut, no formula that tells you what the pattern's going to be at any given time. You have to just let that algorithm run its course.
That actually reminds me of those time-lapse videos you see of plants growing. Like, that they're going to grow, but you can't really predict the exact shape of every leaf or branch, right?
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And this same idea was actually explored further by another mathematician, Stephen Wolfram. He was really into these one-dimensional cellular automata, and there was one specific rule, Rule 110, that really caught his eye.
What was so special about this Rule 110?
Well, what Wolfram discovered was that even this incredibly simple rule could generate patterns that were so complex that they were almost indistinguishable from random noise.
So you're telling me that the seemingly random chaos we see, even in the universe, could actually be the result of these like incredibly simple rules just playing out on a grand scale. That's kind of blowing my mind a little bit.
It definitely opens up that possibility, doesn't it? And suggests there might be this like deeper level of order underneath what we perceive as pure randomness.
That's a lot to take in. But before we kind of spiral down that rabbit hole too far, I'm curious, how do we actually go about measuring this complexity that comes from these simple rules?
All right, well, this is where we bring in this idea of Kolmogorov complexity. Now, this suggests that the complexity of something can be measured by the shortest possible algorithm or program that you would need to produce it.
So something with low Kolmogorov complexity, that means it could be described by a very short algorithm.
Exactly. Let me give you an example. Think about a long string of alternating zeros and ones. Now, that's actually less complex than a totally random sequence of the same length, because you can describe it with a really simple rule, right? Just repeat 0 and 1. But if you have a truly random sequence, well, the shortest description you can give is the sequence itself.
Ah, so the more efficiently you can describe something, the less complex it actually is. But it can't just be about the instructions themselves, right? Like it takes time and energy for complexity to actually unfold, just like a seed needs time and energy to grow into a tree.
You hit the nail on the head there. And that's exactly where this idea of logical depth comes into play. It's a way to measure the time it actually takes to compute the output of an algorithm. So the longer it takes, the greater its logical depth.
So it's not just about having the information, it's about processing it, giving it time to unfold.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really cool, because this concept beautifully connects us to the worlds of physics and biology. Remember the concept of entropy from thermodynamics?
Vaguely.
Well, it turns out that entropy, which is the measure of disorder, is actually related to missing information.
Okay, hold on. You're going to have to unpack that one for me a bit. How can disorder be linked to information?
Okay, think about it this way. The more ordered a system is, the more information we have about it. If you have a box with gas molecules all neatly arranged on one side, well, you know exactly where everything is, right?
Yeah.
But as those molecules start to spread out and that disorder or entropy increases, you lose information about their exact positions.
So more entropy means more missing information, more uncertainty.
Exactly. To really illustrate this, let's dive into a classic thought experiment called Maxwell's demon. Now picture a box that's divided in two and is filled with gas molecules just moving around randomly. And there's this tiny little demon who controls a door between these two compartments. Now this demon can selectively let fast molecules to one side and slow molecules to the other.
So the demon is essentially sorting the molecules, creating order without actually using any energy.
Right. And this seems to violate the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always has to increase in a closed system. But here's the catch. The demon needs information about the speed of each molecule to make those decisions. It's that information itself that allows it to seemingly decrease the entropy.
So information itself can actually be a form of order, and it's key in determining the state of a system. But how does all of this relate to biological systems like the brain?
Well, you see, just like a computer program, the brain processes information and generates these complex outputs. Take the intricate branching patterns of a neuron's dendrites, for example. Those could actually be generated through processes that are similar to what we call L systems, which are algorithms for creating like plant-like structures.
So you're saying the very structure of our brains could be the result of these simple rules just repeating over time and leading to these amazingly complex networks.
It's a fascinating way to look at it, isn't it? It challenges that whole idea of a detailed blueprint, suggesting a much more dynamic process of growth and adaptation.
It really does. But are these algorithms only shaping the physical structure? Or are they also at play in the processes happening inside our cells?
Oh, they're involved in both. A really great example of algorithms working within cells is something called transcription factor cascades.
Okay, I'm going to need a little help with that one. What are transcription factor cascades exactly?
All right, so imagine a chain reaction where the output of one step ends up triggering the next one. Now, transcription factors are these proteins that bind to DNA and activate certain genes. And those activated genes can then go on to produce other transcription factors. So what you get is this cascading process where each step influences the next, leading to a constantly evolving state within the cell.
So kind of like a domino effect, but on a molecular level. One gene getting flipped on can set off this whole chain of events.
Precisely. And this highlights a really crucial point. Biological systems are dynamic. They're always changing. We have techniques like single-cell sequencing that give us these detailed snapshots of a cell's state, but they don't capture the whole history of interactions that actually led to that state.
It's kind of like taking a single frame from a movie. You see what's happening at that one moment, but you're missing the whole story leading up to it.
Exactly. To really understand a biological system, we need to appreciate the unfolding process, the algorithm that's actually driving its development. And that brings us to a really important distinction in developmental biology: instructive and permissive signals.
So are we talking about commands versus permissions for the cell?
That's a good way to think about it, but honestly, it's not always so clear-cut. Instructive signals, they provide very specific directions, like a chemotractant guiding a neuron's growth, for example. But permissive signals, they're more like prerequisites. They're setting the stage, creating the right conditions for a cell to actually act on those instructions.
So, like, you need both the map and the fuel to get to your destination.
Perfect analogy. But it's often much more nuanced than that, too. You see, signals often work together, kind of creating these composite instructions that are guiding cell behavior.
It's like a recipe with multiple ingredients, each one contributing to the final dish. But how do we figure out which of those ingredients are really crucial?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it really gets to this idea of relevance and penetrance in genetics. A gene or a molecule's impact, it can depend heavily on the context and the stage of development that we're talking about.
So the same signal could actually have different effects depending on what else is going on in the cell at that time.
Exactly. And experimentally, this can be incredibly tricky to untangle. Like you might knock out a gene and see a huge impact in one context, but then absolutely no noticeable effect in another. It makes it really hard to pinpoint the exact role of each factor.
It seems like instead of viewing the genetic code as this rigid blueprint, we should be focusing on the dynamic algorithm that's driving the whole developmental process.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial insight. The code itself, it provides the instructions, but the developmental process, the algorithm unfolding over time, is what shapes that organism's complexity.
And this is where we start to see some pretty interesting parallels with the world of artificial intelligence, especially machine learning, right?
Absolutely. AI researchers, they're wrestling with similar questions about how you can get intelligent behavior from these simple rules. And they're moving away from trying to program every single detail. Instead, they're focusing on algorithms that actually allow systems to learn and adapt, much like our own brains do.
So instead of this rigid program, they're creating systems that can actually learn and evolve on their own. It's almost like giving the AI the tools to build its own brain based on its experiences.
Precisely.
This whole concept is just mind-blowing. Who knew that something as complex as the brain might actually be the result of such elegantly simple principles?
It's a truly fascinating area of research, and to be honest, we're only just beginning to scratch the surface of what we can learn from it.
This feels like a good point to pause for now. I mean, we've covered so much ground already today, but don't worry, we'll be back soon to delve even deeper into this world of algorithmic growth and explore more real-world examples of these principles at work.
Welcome back to our deep dive, into this fascinating world of algorithmic growth.
Yeah, it's a really thought-provoking idea. And, it's funny, when we talk about development, we often use this metaphor of a blueprint. Like our genes, they contain these detailed plans for building an organism, right? But maybe that metaphor isn't quite right.
I think you're onto something there. That blueprint analogy, it kind of implies this static, predetermined plan. But development, it's anything but static. It's a dynamic process. It's constantly responding to feedback and adjusting its course along the way.
Yeah, it's more like those choose your own adventure books, where the story unfolds based on the choices that you make.
Yep.
And you never really know exactly how it's going to end.
That is a fantastic analogy. And, in biological development, those choices are being made based on a combination of genetic instructions and those environmental cues. It's that interplay between genes and the environment that really drives the emergence of complexity.
So instead of a blueprint, maybe the genome is more like a recipe. It provides the ingredients and maybe some general guidelines. But the final outcome, it really depends on how those ingredients interact and how the environment influences that whole process.
Exactly. And, just like a skilled chef can create endless variations on a basic recipe, the developmental algorithm can generate this remarkable diversity of forms from a relatively limited set of genetic instructions.
That makes me think about all the variations that we see between individuals, even within the same species. Like no two oak trees are exactly alike, even though they share the same basic genetic code.
Right. And, those variations, they come from the flexibility of the developmental process. If development were strictly deterministic, then every single organism would be an identical clone. And that's obviously not the case. There's this delicate balance between order and randomness, between those instructions in the genes and the unpredictable influences of the environment.
It's almost like nature's constantly experimenting, trying out new combinations and seeing what works. Speaking of experimentation, how do scientists actually study these complex developmental processes? I know you mentioned single-cell sequencing earlier, but are there any other methods that researchers are using to try and understand how this algorithmic growth unfolds?
Oh, absolutely. One really powerful approach is something called lineage tracing. And basically what this allows scientists to do is track the descendants of a single cell as an organism develops. So by labeling a specific cell early on and then observing, which cells arise from it over time, they can actually reconstruct this lineage tree, like a family tree for cells, and understand how all these different cell types are generated.
Oh, so it's like creating a family tree for cells, tracing their ancestry back to their common progenitor.
Precisely. And this technique has revealed some pretty amazing insights. For example, we now know that a single neural stem cell can give rise to a remarkable diversity of neuron types in the brain.
Wow, that's incredible. So one single cell has the potential to generate this whole cast of characters in the brain, each with its own, unique role to play.
Exactly. And that diversity, it all comes from the interplay of signals and feedback loops within that developing brain. As each cell divides and differentiates, it's receiving cues from its neighbors and its environment. And all of that influences its fate and shapes the overall structure of the brain.
It makes you wonder, if we could, rewind the tape of development and start over, would we end up with the same brain twice? Or would those tiny little variations actually lead to a completely different outcome?
That's a question that really gets to the heart of the whole nature versus nurture debate, right?
Yeah.
We know that genes are undeniably crucial in shaping who we are, but so is our environment.
It's like those nature documentaries where you see birds migrating, each bird is following the same basic instincts, but their individual flight paths are all slightly different. They're being influenced by the wind and the movements of their neighbors.
That's a great analogy. It really highlights just how beautifully complex biological systems are. You have this underlying order, a set of rules, but then you also have this degree of randomness, of flexibility that allows for adaptation and variation.
This makes me think about how scientists are trying to create artificial intelligence that can mimic the brain. Are they trying to replicate those complex developmental processes too?
Well, it really depends on the approach. In traditional AI, researchers were trying to program every single detail of an intelligent system. They would explicitly define its rules and behaviors, but like we've been talking about, that can get incredibly complex and difficult to manage, especially with systems as intricate as the brain.
Right. It'd be like trying to write a computer program that specifies the exact position of every neuron in the brain and how they're all connected. That would be an absolutely overwhelming task.
Exactly. And that's why many researchers are now turning to these more biologically inspired approaches, like machine learning. You see, in machine learning, the focus is on creating algorithms that allow systems to actually learn from data and adapt, just like the brain does.
So instead of programming every detail, they're giving the AI the tools to build its own brain based on its experiences.
Precisely. And this approach, it's leading to some pretty remarkable advances in AI. Things like self-driving cars, facial recognition systems, and increasingly sophisticated language translation programs.
It's incredible that we're starting to unlock those secrets of how the brain learns and adapts, and then using that knowledge to create machines that can do the same. But this also brings up some, ethical questions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. As AI systems become more and more powerful, we have to carefully consider both the risks and the benefits. We need to make sure they're being used responsibly and that they align with our values as a society.
It really feels like we're entering this new era where the lines between the natural and artificial worlds are starting to blur. It's crucial that we proceed with both caution and excitement, recognizing both the incredible potential but also the potential pitfalls.
I couldn't agree more. This is a conversation that needs to involve not just scientists and engineers, but ethicists, policymakers, and the public as well. The future of AI is something that we need to shape together.
Well said. It seems like we've reached another natural pause in our exploration of algorithmic growth. We've covered a lot of ground, from those basic principles of cellular automata to the complexities of biological development and the exciting advances in AI.
We certainly have. But there's still much more to explore. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll be going even deeper into the philosophical implications of algorithmic growth and how these ideas really challenge our notions of free will, consciousness, and even the very nature of reality.
Whoa. That sounds pretty intense. I'm definitely ready to keep going and explore those big questions with you.
I'm looking forward to it. Let's take a moment to gather our thoughts, and then we'll dive into the deep end.
All right, so we're back and ready to kind of tackle the philosophical side of all this algorithmic growth stuff. I have to admit, this is the part that's got me, really curious, but maybe even a little intimidated.
Yeah, it definitely gets into some territory that sparks a lot of debate and some, deep thought. But I think that's what makes it so fascinating, don't you?
Absolutely. So Where do we even begin with something as, I don't know, as big as the philosophy of algorithmic growth?
Well, maybe we could start with a question that, people have been pondering for centuries.
Hmm.
Free will. If our brains are essentially like biological algorithms, following a set of rules, does that mean that our choices are all predetermined? Do we actually have any real control over our actions, or are we just kind of playing out a script that's already been written?
That is a question that's both like really intriguing and also a little, I don't know, unsettling. I mean, it definitely feels like I'm making choices all the time. But if my brain is basically this network of algorithms, couldn't those algorithms theoretically predict every single decision I make?
It's a real head scratcher, isn't it? And it's one that's challenged both philosophers and scientists for ages. There's no easy answer here. Some people firmly believe that free will is simply an illusion, just a product of our minds trying to make sense of a universe that's ultimately deterministic. But then others, they maintain that true free will actually does exist, even within the constraints of a physical system, like our brains.
It's like one of those optical illusions where you see two different images depending on how you're looking at it, you know? Maybe free will is kind of similar. It all just depends on your perspective.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. And I think it's important to remember that even if our choices are being influenced by algorithms, those algorithms are incredibly complex. And they're constantly evolving, too. It's not like they're these simple little programs that are just dictating our every move.
Right. They're shaped by our genes, our experiences, every interaction we have with the world. It's that dynamic interplay that makes this whole concept of algorithmic growth so fascinating.
Absolutely. And this kind of leads us to another big question: consciousness. If complexity can arise from simple rules, could consciousness itself actually be an emergent property of those algorithmic processes happening in the brain?
Okay, now we're really going depth. But seriously, how can we even begin to explain something as subjective and mysterious as consciousness in terms of algorithms?
It's a tough one, no doubt. But there are scientists out there who believe that by understanding the algorithms that govern brain activity, we might eventually be able to identify what we call the neural correlates of consciousness. Basically, the specific patterns of activity that give rise to our actual experience of the world.
So it's like we're searching for that signature of consciousness within the code of the brain.
Exactly. Now, we're still a long way from having a complete understanding of consciousness, for sure. But this research is definitely starting to provide some really intriguing clues. For instance, some studies have suggested that conscious awareness might be linked to the synchronization of activity across different regions of the brain, kind of creating that unified experience.
Like a symphony orchestra, where every instrument plays its part. But it's the coordinated effort of the entire ensemble that creates that beautiful music.
Another great analogy. And, just like a conductor can influence the tempo and dynamics of the orchestra, maybe our conscious minds can actually modulate those underlying algorithms in our brains, shaping our thoughts and our actions in the process.
That's a really powerful thought, that we might actually have some level of control over the very algorithms that make us who we are. But that also brings up the question of responsibility, doesn't it? Like, if our actions are ultimately being driven by algorithms, can we really be held accountable for them?
Yeah, that's a crucial question, and it's one that's becoming even more relevant as we develop these increasingly sophisticated AI systems. Like, if a self-driving car makes a mistake and causes an accident, who's really to blame? Is it the programmer, the owner of the car, the AI itself?
It's almost like we're creating this whole new category of moral actors, entities that can make decisions and actually act in the world. But their decision-making processes are fundamentally different from our own.
It's a brave new world, that's for sure. And it's going to require us to rethink our ethical frameworks and even our legal systems to accommodate these new forms of intelligence.
It's both incredibly exciting and a little bit daunting all at the same time, isn't it? We're right on the verge of creating technologies that could fundamentally change what it means to be human.
It's true. And that's exactly why these conversations are so important right now. We need to be exploring the philosophical implications of algorithmic growth, and considering those ethical challenges that lie ahead. We have to be mindful of the potential risks, but also embrace the incredible opportunities these technologies might offer.
Well said. It feels like we've come full circle in this deep dive. We started with those basic principles of algorithmic growth, and now we've ended up with some of the most profound philosophical questions out there about, the nature of reality, consciousness, and even free will. So as we wrap up, what really stands out to you from our exploration today?
For me, the most compelling part is how this concept actually connects all these seemingly different fields like computer science, biology, philosophy. It really highlights how interconnected knowledge is, and it reminds us that pursuing understanding in one area can lead to these incredibly profound insights in others.
I couldn't agree more. And for our listeners out there, what will you be pondering as you go about your day? Maybe this deep dive has sparked some new questions for you or given you a whole new lens through which to see the world around you.
We really hope you've enjoyed this exploration of algorithmic growth, and we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas on your own.
Absolutely. Thank you all for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next time, keep questioning, keep